What is enlightenment? It's become trendy to talk about non-duality, and as a part of that, it's become fashionable to talk about enlightenment. You can see people who claim that they are enlightened, or that a particular guru is enlightened, or that a particular guru from the past was enlightened. The problem is that if we are to say that someone is enlightened, we have to define enlightenment. And that might be much more difficult than most people think. Because it seems to me that many, especially in the non-duality movement, they're very quick to start defining what enlightenment means, or steps to enlightenment, or signs that you are enlightened. But there are also some scholars that say, or spiritual teachers who say, that you can't actually say anything about enlightenment, and it's wiser not to talk about it at all. Now, I think there's a middle way there, because perhaps we can talk about why we can't talk about enlightenment. And maybe that will help us. So, what is enlightenment? Well, there's actually a clue in the Indian tradition called Advaita Vedanta. Because Advaita actually means not something. Advaita is normally translated as not two, but there are those who say that a better translation would be not dual, and I'll return to that. But the important point here is the word not. Why aren't they just defining what something is, instead of talking about what it is not? And the clue we can pick up from this is that there are certain spiritual, what do you want to call it, concepts, ideas, states, that are so different from our normal state of mind that they can't be described by the words and concepts that we normally use. And therefore, instead of talking about what it is, you talk about what it is not. And that's important to grasp, because if enlightenment is to have any kind of meaning, it's a state of mind, a state of consciousness that is an alternative to our normal state of consciousness. Just think about that. I'm not talking about something that's where we can say that here's a scale of human consciousness and we can raise our consciousness, and if we go a simple step further, we reach enlightenment. I'm talking about a fundamental shift in consciousness that is a completely different way of looking at reality than what most people are in right now. A fundamental shift. And that's what I think most people, whether they are from this spiritual tradition or from the non-duality movement or wherever, they haven't actually grasped. They think that they, with their present state of mind, can understand and conceptualize what enlightenment is. And that's the fatal flaw, because you can't. That is the whole point. Enlightenment is a state of mind that is so different from the state of mind we are normally in, that our current state of mind can't fathom, can't conceptualize, can't describe with words what enlightenment is. Otherwise, enlightenment has no real meaning or purpose. So, the whole idea of the concept of enlightenment is that we are currently in an unenlightened state. We are currently in a specific state of consciousness. In the Buddhist tradition, this is what the Buddha, he saw this intuitively. He saw that most people are in a state of consciousness that causes suffering. First noble truth. Life is suffering, but actually life in a certain state of consciousness, in a common state of consciousness on earth, is suffering. Because it is the state of consciousness that causes the suffering. And therefore, the Buddha also saw that the way out of suffering is to follow this, what he called the Eightfold Path, until you have a fundamental shift and you don't look at life through the filter that people are looking at life through right now. Because it's the filter, it's the way we look at life that's causing the suffering. Unfortunately, what has happened in the modern world is that our linear Western mindset has taken this concept of enlightenment. And there are two real problems with this. First of all, the linear mindset that we have in the West, it always wants to talk about something ultimate. So here comes Western people with a linear Western mindset, and they hear this, oh, there's this concept of enlightenment. And now they want to project that enlightenment, therefore, must be the ultimate state of consciousness. And I'm not saying it's just Western. Many Buddhists also want to see that the Buddha was the ultimately enlightened being. He had reached the highest possible state of consciousness, which he didn't actually ever say, but that's another matter. So we want to make enlightenment into something ultimate, an ultimate state. And you can see people talking about this, oh, this person was enlightened, this person is enlightened, or I am enlightened, some will say. And they think that this is some ultimate state. You can't go higher. You reach the ultimate awakening, the ultimate state of consciousness. And that's not actually what the Buddha meant. Because he talked about that there is no permanent, unchanging, perfect self. This was in opposition to Hinduism, where they have the concept of the Atman, which is the perfect, ultimate, unchanging self. So the Buddha didn't say that enlightenment is the ultimate state of consciousness. He said it was an awakening from the state of consciousness that most people are in, the state of consciousness that causes suffering. And what is that state of consciousness? Well, it's what I, in many of my non-duality videos, have called the duality consciousness. And I've also said that the problem, and this is the second problem with the modern mindset looking at enlightenment, is that many of these modern non-dual teachers, they are defining enlightenment as a goal to be attained by a simple switch of the mind. It's as if something has happened, a singular event that caused us to fall asleep or go into a dream state, and there's a singular event that can awaken us. And why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because what I explain in many of my videos is that the duality consciousness always has two polarities, two opposite polarities, good and bad, right and wrong. There's a value judgment in the definition of the polarity, so that one is good, one is bad. Now, there can be black and white thinking where you only see the two polarities, or there can be gray thinking where you're focused on the gradations in between. But the point is that in duality, there are two opposite polarities, and then there's a scale in between. And when you think this way, when you're in this state of mind, you're always evaluating. You are, so to speak, rating everything. Is it good? Is it bad? Better or worse? And that's why I said in the title, Enlightenment is overrated, because when you are looking at enlightenment through this filter of the dualistic consciousness, you're going to rate enlightenment on this scale. And therefore you're going to say, well, over here we have the one extreme where people are suffering. And the opposite extreme must be where we are free from suffering, and that must be enlightenment, and therefore enlightenment is the ultimate state of consciousness. You see, it's put on the scale. But the whole idea of enlightenment is that it's not on the dualistic scale. What the Buddha saw when he received his enlightenment was that most people are trapped in this specific state of consciousness dominated by what he called the pairs. And it's because they have this scale with a value judgment of good and bad, right and wrong, this should happen, this shouldn't happen. It's because of that they're suffering. And he also experienced the alternative where you are conscious, you are looking at life, you're looking at the same planet that other people are looking at, but you are not seeing it through the filter of this dualistic scale, the value judgment. You're just seeing it in a way that we might call neutral, with neutral awareness. You're not labeling it, you're not rating it, you're not judging it as this or that. And he saw that attaining this state of consciousness, that's the only way to overcome suffering. And that's why there are those who say we can't really define enlightenment because it's an alternative to the state of consciousness that wants to define everything based on this scale with the two polarities. And people are so trapped in this dualistic state of consciousness. And again, what the Buddha saw, I mean, it was not a theoretical concept. It was not something he came to believe or understand. He experienced. People are trapped in this specific state of consciousness, but they don't see it. They don't realize they're trapped. And that's the whole point. It's like this example I've given several times. You put on a pair of glasses and everything you see is colored. You're still seeing the same things, but everything is colored by the glasses. And if you had colored contact lenses put on your eyes at birth, you would grow up thinking the world was colored because you've never seen an alternative. And that's the state of mind that most people are in. They're trapped in the dualistic state of consciousness, evaluating, rating everything on the scale. They've never experienced an alternative, or at least they aren't aware of it. And so they don't realize that everything they see is colored. And that's why the Buddha saw that as long as you're in this state of consciousness, you can't overcome suffering. Because suffering is built into that state of consciousness. Because you have a value judgment. This should happen to me, this should not happen to me. And that means that when you are expecting something should happen and it doesn't happen, you're going to suffer. When there's something you don't want to have happen and it does happen, you're going to suffer. You're constantly running towards a goal, but you're not there, so you're suffering. You're constantly running away from something, but you haven't escaped it fully, so you're suffering. And the only way out of suffering is to get out of that state of consciousness that causes the suffering. And as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem with the same state of consciousness that created the problem. You can't overcome suffering with the same state of consciousness that creates the suffering. So, this is what the Buddha saw. And of course he experienced the alternative, namely what we might call neutral awareness. I talk about neutral awareness as in contrast to this very biased, evaluating, judging, rating consciousness that I call the duality consciousness. So instead of rating and judging everything, we could be in a state of consciousness where we're neutral, we're just observing. It isn't good or bad, it just is what it is. And we deal with it and move on with life. And the Buddha also saw, 2,500 years ago, that overcoming this state of consciousness isn't something that can just be done by snapping your fingers. And that's why he defined the Eightfold Path that we have to follow. And that's another problem with the modern Western mindset, because here you have these people in the West who ever since the 1960s, more and more people have become interested in something spiritual, and they have often, because Christianity doesn't offer them anything spiritual, they have looked to the East. So here are people with a linear Western mindset that find an Eastern teaching that talks about enlightenment, and they want to have it now. I mean, we are so used to in the West instant gratification. You whip out the credit card and you're supposed to have enlightenment delivered to your door in 5 minutes by Amazon. And, you know, this has created this entire, you know, non-dual movement where they think, oh, all this talk in the East about following a long path, that's just old-fashioned. We just need to switch our mind and then we can be enlightened instantly. And then they will cite, oh, this person was enlightened instantly, or that person. But even Ramana Maharshi, whom they often quote, he admitted that he had done work in past lifetimes to get himself to a point where he could attain the supposedly spontaneous enlightenment that he attained. So, so once you get into this, what are you actually doing? Well, you are not seeking to attain enlightenment. All of these people who haven't understood what I said about the duality consciousness and who think enlightenment can be achieved instantly, they are not seeking enlightenment. They are seeking a mental image, a concept of enlightenment that is actually created from the duality consciousness. That's why I started saying the problem is, in duality, you have one polarity, suffering, you have an opposite polarity, not suffering, happiness, bliss, and this is enlightenment. So you think that you can escape suffering by going to the opposite dualistic polarity, but you are still, they will still keep you in duality, and therefore you are not going to get out of suffering. You may temporarily make yourself believe that you have gotten out of suffering, but this is not enlightenment. It's just a concept you created in the mind. I explained that in more depth in several of my videos about non-duality, how you can use the duality consciousness to create this concept of no self, of nothingness, of happiness and bliss, but it's just an experience you're having while you're still in duality. And that's why the central thing to grasp about enlightenment is it is not dual. And this is another problem with Eastern philosophy, because Eastern philosophy has this saying, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. So they're believing, and that's why they translate Advaita with not two, they're believing that there's only Brahman who is one, undifferentiated, undivided. But as soon as Brahman creates something, there's a duality. But that's not the case. As I also explained, Brahman created the world out of its own being. It knows what it's created. Brahman is not confused about the differentiation in the world. Brahman sees that all the differentiation in the world is just an expression of its own being. But that's what you can't see when you're in duality, because in duality you are only thinking in terms of separation. So as soon as there's differentiation, the world must be fundamentally different from Brahman. And that's why you have this entire spiritual tradition in the East that the world is an enemy of your spiritual growth, because spiritual growth is you return to your source. You return to the undifferentiated, or the Atman, the universal self, and you basically cease to exist as an individual. And that's a fatal flaw in Eastern spirituality. And when you take that over with the Western mindset, well, you have these concepts of no self. And you have these people who say, oh, I'm in a state of no self. I am not here. There's nobody here talking. Talking is just happening. And that's just an illusion created from the duality consciousness. It's not escaping the duality consciousness, and therefore it's not enlightenment. So what is enlightenment? Well, it's not duality. It's not the duality consciousness. That's the best thing you can say about it. But at least by saying what we have said so far, we have clarified what enlightenment is not. And that gives us a new way to look at, for example, the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, because the essence of the Eightfold Path, the real goal of it, is to shift from the duality consciousness to the non-dual consciousness. So how do we do that? Well, that's where we have to be willing to recognize that every spiritual teaching is given for its specific time. And 2,500 years ago, people didn't have the understanding of the psyche that we have today. So there was a limit to what the Buddha could give people. Not because the Buddha was limited, but because people's ability to understand was limited. And one of the big challenges for the Buddha was precisely that when he was ready to go out and teach, he was confronted with this question that who would be able to grasp his teaching? It was so beyond people's normal state of consciousness. And he responded to that by saying, some will understand. And we have to realize in today's age, many more people are ready to understand. But in order to understand and grasp it, you have to be willing to step back and realize that you cannot grasp enlightenment or the Buddha's teachings through the filter of duality. And this represents a fundamental challenge, and I understand this because I've been on the path for a long time, and for the first many years I was exactly in the state of consciousness I'm talking about. I thought there was a goal, because obviously if you're going to motivate anybody to follow a path, they're going to have a goal. You're going to have to give them a goal that they want, right? So if people are suffering, you have to give them a goal. It's possible to escape suffering. But the problem is that however you define that goal, people are going to look at it through the filter of duality, and therefore they are going to superimpose their dualistic interpretation, concepts, mental images upon it. And that's what people have been doing for 2,500 years with the Buddha's teachings about enlightenment. They have created a mental image of what enlightenment is, but that mental image was based on what they could see from the state of duality. Now again, you can't really say there's anything wrong with that, because what can people do? But all I'm trying to say with this video is, there are many, many people in today's age who are ready to come to this realization that I've talked about, where you realize that the point of it all, the point of all spiritual striving, is not to reach some state that you can define based on duality. It's actually to go beyond the state of consciousness that's affected by duality. It's to reach a fundamentally different state of consciousness. And I think many people are ready to understand that you have to go through a period where you are willing to recognize that part of what drives you on the spiritual path is your vision of the goal. But your goal is polluted by the duality consciousness. And therefore you essentially have to go through a period where you are striving for a goal, but you are deliberately, consciously not defining it. You are not trying to define it as some people do it. Oh, enlightenment is bliss. You have to let go of these definitions. You have to let go of all definitions. Just put them aside. Basically, you have to let go of them permanently, because what will happen is, if you are striving to attain enlightenment based on this mental image that is defined by the duality consciousness, you will never escape the duality consciousness, because whatever spiritual experiences you have, you're going to superimpose that dualistic interpretation upon them. And that's what you see with many of these non-dual teachers. You can have a genuine spiritual experience, and I've explained this also in many of my videos, that the core of our being is what I call the conscious you, which is not the outer personality. We've just taken on the outer personality. And it's possible for the conscious you to step outside of the outer personality, and that's when we have a genuine, mystical, spiritual, non-dual experience. We experience, often just for a glimpse in the beginning, we experience as an alternative to our normal state of consciousness. But the problem is that if we are so attached to this dualistic definition of enlightenment, as soon as we are out of that experience, our mind will superimpose a dualistic interpretation on the experience. And it's perfectly possible to have an experience of neutral or pure awareness where you don't have the normal sense of self that you have, because you're outside your normal sense of identity. But it's not a state of no self. But if you have a certain mental image of what the path means, then once you're out of the actual experience, now you're back in a dualistic state of mind that interprets and evaluates and judges everything. Now you're going to superimpose your dualistic image upon the pure experience. And you'll say, oh, that means I have no self. There is no self. And that's a problem, because now you are just reinforcing that experience that you are having inside your head, inside your mind. You try and just step back and grasp what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is, normally we have a certain experience. We have the colored glasses on. That's the duality consciousness. When we have a genuine mystical spiritual experience, we take off the glasses. And for a glimpse, we are just seeing without the glasses, no coloring. Then that experience subsides. Now we have the glasses on again. But we haven't forgotten the experience. But we have to find a way to interpret that experience through the glasses, so that it validates our worldview. And that's what happens to many of these non-dual, both the teachers and the students. They have genuine experiences of stepping outside the normal state of consciousness. But because they have a very strong belief in this non-dual worldview that they have come to accept, soon as they are out of the pure experience, they are superimposing an interpretation on the experience. And the same thing has happened to Buddhists throughout the ages, to the people from the Advaita Vedanta tradition, from any other spiritual tradition. It's the central challenge on earth, is we are trapped in a certain state of consciousness. The only way to really get out of that state of consciousness is, as I said, the conscious you steps outside of your normal state of mind and experiences itself as pure or neutral awareness. That's the only way out. But the problem is that as soon as we are back in our normal state of consciousness, we will superimpose our worldview, our spiritual beliefs, upon the experience. And now, take note of this. You first have a polluted experience. That's the normal state of consciousness. Now you have a pure experience. But then you switch back into the polluted state of mind. And now you take that pure experience and you create a mental image based on a polluted state of mind. And that mental image becomes your new experience in duality. You had an experience before, perhaps of suffering. Now you're creating a new experience of not suffering, of having no self, of being enlightened, being awakened. But it's still in duality. It's still an experience you're creating inside your mind. Whereas enlightenment means that you come to a point, you've had enough of these experiences of neutral awareness, that you awaken from the identification with the outer mind, the dualistic mind. You realize this is not who you are. And therefore, you start to systematically question all these illusions you have in your outer mind. And this is the process, whether you call it the Eightfold Path, or the spiritual path, or the path of awakening. This is the process. And that's why there's no instant enlightenment. You can have an experience of a neutral state of consciousness, but you still have to go back and clean up what is in your subconscious mind that pulled you out of enlightenment in the first place, that pulled you into duality, and that keeps you in duality. It's like you have a ship that's anchored, and the captain of a ship gets the idea he wants to travel to the farther shore, concept in Buddhism, enlightenment. So he gets this idea that there's this wonderful land where the streets are paved with gold and people are just going to throw money and jewels at him when he gets there. So he wants to travel there. And he sets sail. And the wind is filling the sails, and it seems like the boat is really moving forward because you hear the rushing of the wind. But there are 157 anchors that are holding back the boat, and they're still there, anchored in the bottom of the sea. So the boat isn't moving. He just thinks it is. And then suddenly the clouds part, and now he sees some shore way out there, and he thinks, oh, I'm getting closer, I'm getting closer. Now the clouds close again, and he's convinced that he's getting closer. And he's convinced that he can just keep looking forward. He doesn't need to look back and look at these anchors and cut the ropes that are holding the anchors. That's how many people are, both in the non-duality movement and in other spiritual movements. We think we can just focus on the positive. We don't have to look at our own psychology. That will not lead to enlightenment. Why? Because, as I also explained in several videos, we start out seeing ourselves as connected beings. We're connected to something outside our own minds, our higher selves, and our spiritual teachers. The alternative is that we can use our free will to go into the state of separation, where we now see ourselves as separate beings, and this is duality. In duality, you see yourself as a separate being, separated from your source, separated from the environment you're in, separated from other people. And once we start going into duality, as I explained, we suddenly have an explanation problem. And so we come up with all of these illusions that create these separate selves that I've described in several videos. And they cause us to go deeper and deeper into duality. It's like we go into a maze and we come to a turn and we decide to go this way instead of that way. That creates a subconscious self based on an illusion. This leads us down another path where there's another division. We choose to go that way, creating another separate self. So we go into the duality consciousness by making decisions to accept certain illusions. And the only way to get back out of duality is to look at each decision and consciously reverse it by seeing the higher reality that exposes the illusion. We took steps to go into duality, and we will have to reverse those steps to get out. It's not enough to be deep in the maze and realize, oh, there must be a way out of the maze, and instantly you're catapulted to the exit. It just doesn't happen that way. And thinking it does is a mental image created based on duality, and this has nothing to do with enlightenment. Okay, so I think if what I have said here hasn't helped you, then it doesn't matter how much more I say, it won't make any difference. So I think I'll simply stop here and say that that was what I felt was coming to me right now about enlightenment. And I hope this has helped you. I hope this has helped you rethink your approach to the spiritual path and rethink your view of what enlightenment is and what it isn't.